This is the You Can Learn Chinese podcast. For everyone who's trying to learn Chinese or reaching for the next level, you came to the right place. I am your host, Jared Turner, longtime resident of China, co-founder of the Mandarin Companion Graded Reader Series, and honestly, statistically speaking, 6 out of 7 dwarves are not happy. My co-host is John Pasden, co-founder of Mandarin Companion, founder of All Set Learning, the Chinese Grammar Wiki, Sinosplice.com, and is probably the best meat eater in the world. So you think you're funny? Can you be funny in Chinese? In this episode, John and I are going to discuss humor in Chinese, some of the cultural differences of Chinese humor, and after listening to this, you'll either have Chinese friends laughing at your jokes or laughing at you. Either or. Guest interview is with Laszlo Montgomery, host of the famous China History podcast, just celebrating its 10-year anniversary. All this and more, let's get to it. Also, just a note, we had a little bit of audio recording issues on this episode, so bear with us. Hey guys, this is Jared Turner coming at you from Utah.
Hey guys, I am John Pasden in Shanghai, China.
All right, John, before we cut into things, we have got a couple reviews.
Okay, so this one is from Lan Da Wei. Comprehensible input and extensive reading. Hello, John and Jared. I was planning to go to China this summer for 1 month of immersion learning until the coronavirus ruined everything. Outcomes, Plan B. I signed up for lessons on italki and I'm making friends in China using HelloTalk. I found that HelloTalk is a good way to communicate and get instant feedback. Topics you've mentioned, such as comprehensible input, have been invaluable to me as I'm discussing various topics with my online friends. Some of my friends want to improve their English reading skills, so I put what I've learned from Mandarin Companion to good use and got recommendations from Jared to provide English extensive reading materials.
That's awesome. That's great to hear.
One friend is reading Charlotte's Web to me. I provide corrections. I'm reading a Chinese Breeze graded reader, and my friend corrects my pronunciation. Don't worry, guys. The next graded reader will be one of yours. Thanks for sharing your thoughts on language acquisition. They're not only taking my Mandarin up a notch, but they're helping people learn English too. Keep up the great work. Well, thanks a lot, David, and we appreciate the feedback. And we're also happy that you're using HelloTalk, italki. We've mentioned these in other podcasts, and they're definitely good for getting additional practice.
All right, we have got another one from Vasily Sarantsev from Russia. And she says, best Mandarin learning podcast ever. Guys, I'm so happy I found your podcast. It really levels up the methodology of learning. Thanks. Well, hey, we appreciate that, Vasily.
So what we want to talk a little bit about today is what is it with Chinese humor? Like, why is it so hard for us to joke in Chinese? Are there any tips? Is there anything about the culture that we should be aware of? Because if you've ever, especially lived in China or had conversations in Chinese, you've probably tried to make jokes in Chinese and you have probably crashed and burned miserably. I know Jared has.
Oh, yeah. But I think it's important to note that, achieving humor, I think in any language, it can be elusive, right? There's times where I tell a joke and I'm like, ha ha, and I'm like laughing. And then everyone's just like, crickets are chirping. In the distance, a dog barks, tumbleweed rolls, through the room, something like that. And, people just, it's not funny.
For me, it went through a number of stages. Like in the beginning, I couldn't communicate. So I had to level up my Chinese. Then I became fairly conversational. I'm like, okay, I'm conversational. Now let the jokes begin. And, they were all terrible. No one ever laughed. It was just total failure after failure. And so I eventually got to a point where I was like, okay, something is not working. I don't know whether it's me or the culture or what, but I'm just going to stop trying to make jokes because it seems to be a waste of time. And I'll just kind of spend more time observing what people actually laugh at because it's not me. And I might as well try to learn from the native speakers and learn from my environment. So it was much later when my Chinese was already much better that I started to have some success in making jokes. And it tended to be kind of a low-key, understated humor. It was not the in-your-face sarcasm. And I think for me, what helped a lot is my wife, because my wife is pretty hilarious. She's one of the funniest Chinese people I know. And so she's good at humor in Chinese.
Oh, I'll vouch for this.
And I've just learned a lot from observing her and, joking around with her. And if I joke with her and my joke is not funny, then she'll brutally let me know. But I think I have gotten funnier in Chinese over the years. Maybe I'm not hilarious, but I'm a little less crash and burn.
I have a quick funny story. So this one time I got an email from your wife, but it was like a spam thing. I think they were just had sent it from her email. And so I replied to it and I said, is this spam or is this real? And she replies, spam, just for you. I don't know. I bust up chuckling at that. I'm like, she's funny.
That is good. But that was in English, right?
It was in English, yes.
Hmm.
It gets back to that point you're saying is that it takes familiarity with the culture in order to be funny in Chinese.
Yeah, and honestly, it's not something that you can easily just pinpoint. Like in Chinese, if you want to make a joke, follow these steps. I can say like, oh, that doesn't seem like it would work too well in Chinese, just based on a gut feeling. But it's hard to lay out exactly what the difference is. I actually do have a classic Sinosplice, that's my blog, entry on Chinese humor. And I'm not going to go into detail on the joke itself. That's in the blog entry. The point is this. When you get to the end of the joke and you tell the punchline, in English, we tend to stop before you lay out everything and you let the listener kind of make the final connections on their own. And often that's kind of part of what makes them feel like it's funny. But in the Chinese example, you actually spell out, this is why the joke is funny. And the audience will wait for that and then they'll laugh. And as a Westerner, it's easy to kind of make the conclusion like, wow, the Chinese aren't too quick. Wow, they need jokes spelled out for them. But really, it's just a cultural thing. All right, so I think our audience does want to hear a little bit about how we've crashed and burned with humor a bit more.
Now, I've mentioned this on the podcast before, but my wife and I, we opened a bakery in Shanghai and we do cinnamon rolls. And I'm going to tell you, like, I've worked days, hours, months in that store and interacting with Chinese customers all the time. So customers would come in and there were a few things I used to do, which kind of, at least in my opinion, be funny. And John, you've been to our bakery, Cinnaswirl, there before, right?
Yeah, man, more recently than you have.
So tell us, so when you order a cinnamon roll, you get a choice of different levels of frosting. So which one do you usually pick?
I think regular. Got to watch that sugar intake,
You do. And man, that cream cheese frosting, I'm telling you, it's really good. Chinese customers, they come in and most of them, they don't like things that are too sweet. So, we ask them if you want frosting. A lot of times they say, xiaotang, which is, light frosting. But we have 4 levels of frosting. We have actually 5, you could say. There's no frosting, light, medium, heavy. And then we have this one that's just over the top. It's called tremendous. And at the highest level, it's a bit ridiculous, but he says lihai tang, which is, tremendous doesn't quite work, in Chinese, but it sounds funny. John doesn't think it sounds funny.
It's kind of a weird translation. It's not something a Chinese person would do, right?
Exactly. And that was the whole idea because it's just kind of like over the top. Anyway, so sometimes we have customers come in and usually they're girls and they're ordering cinnamon roll. And I'm like, what kind of frosting do you want? Do you want, light, medium, heavy, or tremendous? And they'll be like, oh, xiaotang, light frosting. I'm like, oh, zhenchangtangs, regular frosting? No, xiaotang. And I'm like, duotang, which is like heavy frosting. And like, no, xiaotang. I'm like, oh, lihai tang. And they're like, no. And I'm like, kai wan xiao. And then they'd be like, oh, and I've literally done that, John, like thousands of times.
So you like playing the foreigner card, like, oh, the foreigner doesn't understand me. I'm going to get way more frosting than I want. And like horrify them. But then,
exactly.
But then when you tell them they're kidding.
And you get a wide range of responses, but like their eyes would get increasingly large to like, we get to like, tremendous frosting. They're like, no, not that much. And I'm like, I'm just kidding. And I'd even start like putting the frosting on. And I'm telling you, the tremendous frosting, it's like 2 layers of thick frosting.
But come on, they might just be laughing in relief that they're not going to get way more frosting than they want rather than thinking it's funny. I think maybe you have more fun with that joke than they do.
Maybe I do, but my employees always seem to laugh at it too. They're kind of like, hey.
I feel like this is a joke that's like evolving. Like you're starting to get an appreciation for what amuses people, but it's not quite like native like at all. Let me just make one little comment about humor that totally doesn't work, because I think I've seen some foreigners try to do this. You know how like in recent years in American TV shows and stuff, like there's this kind of, it's almost like a lame punchline where someone's like, seriously? And it's kind of funny the way they say it. Like, don't try to do that in Chinese. You're like, 真的, like, I don't know, 你是认真的吗? Like, it does not work.
John, as you were saying that, it reminds me that, I kind of like complete the joke a little bit. I explain what I was doing. And I think when I say that, people find that a little funnier.
Like I was bullying you.
Yeah.
Verbally. I was verbally assaulting you. Ha ha.
But it works. It works. But there's a lot of other things I say. One of the classic ones I say when people come to the store. Now, obviously, imagine you walk into a bakery and all they do are cinnamon rolls. What's it going to smell like? Heaven, of course, right? And people come in the door, they're like, oh, it smells good in here. It smells so good. And usually I'll say, oh, 免费when. And they just chuckle right away. And what that means is free smells. So I actually kind of ripped it off Jimmy John's here in the States.
All right. Now, see, that one I think is a good example of humor that works with the Chinese. I can't really tell you why. You know why?
Why? Because it's free.
First of all, you're not bullying anyone. And it's easier to make jokes about like purchases, about prices and, discounts and reasons for giving discounts. Like, the Chinese often like to, like, if you chat with the vendor and you establish a rapport, you start asking for the friend discount. And it's not a joke, but, like, you'll get laughs just because you have this rapport. You know what I'm talking about?
Sometimes as well, John, like we have, like in the store, we'd have volume discounts. So, you buy one, it was like 18 RMB. You buy two is 30, and then, goes down from there. And so sometimes I'd make jokes about the pricing. I'd say, oh, for two, normally it's 40, but for you, it's only 30, And they'd be like, hee.
You and your tea, it's a little bit, I don't know.
Well, yeah, it's
creepy.
Well, thanks, John. I thought it was actually funny. But, this is stuff I do in the store. But, also this is a bit of my style of humor, John, right? And the other thing, too, is I dealt with a lot of people in government jobs. I deal with the Commerce Department, the Health Department. And I'm telling you, the people who are working in these departments, people are coming in and they're angry. They got their walls up, they're overworked and underpaid and things like that. So when I come in, I've done this before with like my employees have been like, don't do this, don't say, and I joke with them or I poke fun at them and it just brings the walls down.
Wait, hold on. So you'll be talking to a government official and you'll be like, nice tie. Where'd you buy that? Like, what are you saying?
So this one time I went to the health department. We were opening up a store in Pudong. And now I'm telling you, like, the lady who was in charge of issuing the health permit for like this area, man, she was a battle axe. Like, my employee went in there once to go see her and she just like ripped everything. This is bad. This is wrong. Anyway. And she was like, you have to change everything. And so I went back with her a week later with some revisions, and I got there, and she's maybe in her 50s, and she just had the stern, like, angry face, And I sit down at her desk, and she looks at me, and she doesn't say anything about me being a foreigner, but obviously, right, I am. And I look at her like, oh, we're this company, and we're opening the store. Oh yeah, I remember you guys. And I'm like, she takes the paper and she starts looking at it and reading it and looking over it, and I'm like, oh, 你太开心了嘛. I'm like, oh, you're too happy. And she looks at me and she grins. And from there, it just all went better. She softened up and I poked a little more fun at some things and went over the top, on like, oh, you're just so nice all the time. Thank you, And it worked.
Okay, but you weren't commenting on how attractive she was or offering bribes, right?
No, that wouldn't have been true at all.
Yeah, I want to put in a disclaimer here. Your mileage may vary. We do not hold ourselves responsible for anything you do if you follow Jared's lead here. All right, one other thing related to humor, which I think is interesting, relates to Chinese culture is Chinese culture changing? Because, the older generation that went through the Cultural Revolution and everything, they have a very special set of life experiences. And I think it kind of makes them quite different in their attitudes towards foreigners, towards humor, all kinds of things. And, kids that are born, in the past 20 years, they're very different. And so if you look at Chinese humor, obviously it's got to be changing. And one thing that's interesting in Shanghai is that stand-up comedy over the past 10 years has become like bigger and bigger in China. Like, it used to be that Chinese didn't really even know what stand-up comedy was. Like, they were used to xiangsheng, which has two people. Stand-up comedy's only got one person. In fact, they sometimes referred to it as one-person xiangsheng because they knew xiangsheng in the crosstalk with two people.
Yeah.
So clearly things are changing, and maybe that means that it'll get easier and easier to make jokes as a foreigner speaking Chinese.
It doesn't xiangsheng mainly like rely on like wordplay and puns and stuff?
Yeah, and it has a straight man and a funny man. It follows a very clear recognized format. So like, you know who's going to be telling the jokes and who's going to be pretending not to get what they're saying, you know? So it's like, it's very familiar and comfortable. But it can still be very clever. It's just, a very Chinese format.
But, something else I've observed, John, is that a lot of listeners here, maybe if you haven't seen it already, you need to follow our Mandarin Companion meme account. We have on Instagram and on Facebook, and it's about learning Chinese. But the funny thing, John, about this is that a lot of times I publish these memes and I make these memes and I'll share them on maybe other areas as well. And if Chinese teachers come across them, typically they look at them and they're like, why is that funny? Or they're like, no, that's wrong. That's not how it is.
Yeah, and to be fair, a lot of older people that, are American or English speaking don't get memes either. They just don't think they're funny. But, when it comes to a Chinese teacher, you got the generation gap and the cultural gap, and it just doesn't quite land with them, does it?
Yeah. Now, a case in point, one of the memes I had made, this was back in June. So the text on it says, how long have you been studying Chinese? Reply, 2 years. And so you can have a conversation in Chinese. And now the picture is of a cat with a microphone up to it. And so it's, the cat's like supposed to be replying. And then, so you can have a conversation in Chinese. And then the cat on the second panel, his eyes get big and they're welling up with tears, And so it's very relatable because as a learner, we're like, oh, I've been studying 2 years. Yeah, great. It must be good. So you can have a conversation in Chinese and you're like, oh, actually, maybe I can't. And it got like over 5,000 likes on this one. But, some of the comments from teachers are kind of like, oh, you just need to study a little bit more. Or I help all my students, review the vocabulary more and create real life situations so that they can learn to have conversations in Chinese. And I'm like, no, that's not the point. Like, you're trying to provide a solution, and that's not the point. It's just funny because us as learners, we can relate to this. We know what it's like.
This topic of humor is difficult. Don't expect to be good at Chinese humor right off the bat.
I think, though, about humor, just in general, it takes practice. All right. So if you are going to try to tell jokes in Chinese, well, sure, go ahead. Sometimes you're going to be the joke, and you got to accept that. But if you look at the stories and the experiences of any stand-up comics, any of these people who we consider really funny, they had years of practicing where they were not that funny or marginally funny. So it's one of those things. I think it's going to come along with practice of the language. You got to be able to be conversant. You have to be able to have a feeling for the language. Also, you have to have an understanding for the culture. And you have to be able to deliver fluently enough that people are going to find it funny, considering it is funny in the first place. So, yeah, stick at it and practice. I mean, I tell you, those stories from my bakery, John, I've seriously told those jokes thousands of times. And so I think my delivery is pretty good now, but it wasn't at the beginning.
And if you'd like a little challenge for Chinese humor yourself, maybe to get a sense for how it doesn't always work, here's a challenge for you. Try to tell the "why did the chicken cross the road" joke in Chinese. See how many laughs you get. There's a challenge.
Crickets. I predict crickets.
And then trying to explain it, which might take half an hour. So make sure your schedule's clear for that one. All right. So now a word from our sponsor.
And our sponsor is
Mandarin Companion.
Today we are talking about one of our original books we published, John. It is The 60-Year Dream. Now, this story is based off of the Washington Irving's original story, Rip Van Winkle.
But if we had, told the story in an American context, that would be a little weird. So we have localized it to the Chinese context, making it, in effect, quite a history-centric book, probably more so than any other book we have.
Absolutely. And, John, I remember when we created this book, you said, hey, I think teachers are going to like this book. You're right. I've talked to a lot of teachers about this book, and they're like, yeah, I've been using this in my classroom, and it gives me so many opportunities to talk about how China changed from the imperial government to, the communist government now, and how things developed and changed over the course of 60 years, obviously. And so there's a whole lot to talk about from that aspect in the book.
Yeah, and in order to make things a little more, smooth or maybe easy for ourselves, we made it 60 years specifically so that we could skip the Mao era because, that brings a lot of complications.
You guys can get it today. You can find it on Amazon, on Kobo, iBooks. You can get your paperback or digital edition in traditional or simplified characters. It's a 60-year dream, Mandarin Companion. Level 1, 300 characters.
All right, thanks for your support and enjoy those books.
All right, now it's time for rants and raves. John, what do you got for us today? You got a rant or a rave?
I have a grumpy rant.
Oh, gosh. Well, lay it on me, man.
All right, so here's my rant. And I kind of hate to get political. Fundamentally, it's not a political rant. But anyway, the political background is that recently we've been hearing news about how some Chinese apps are going to get blocked, like WeChat's going to get blocked in the US, maybe. TikTok is going to get removed from the USA or possibly acquired by Microsoft. What really bothers me about this is not the whole economic struggle or whatever. What bothers me is that these are platforms for people to communicate. These are currently ways that people in the US can communicate directly with people in China. And I think that kind of communication is really valuable. And in fact, that's why I set up my company, All Set Learning. That's why Jared and I do Mandarin Companion, because we want to share the love of learning Chinese with more people. We want to make it possible for more people to become fluent in Chinese and to be able to talk directly with Chinese people. But then when these channels of communication get removed, then you can't have that communication. You have this isolation. To me, that's the worst. Like, you can pull down companies from stock exchange listings and all that. But when you start pulling down channels of communication, I feel like that's detrimental for the studies of everyone learning Chinese, and it's also detrimental to the cause of world peace. I don't think that's an exaggeration. So, yeah, I'm kind of bummed about that. That is my rant.
Yeah, John, it's just really unfortunate. And that's something, in our interview today, we even touch on some of these things about the isolation that's kind of happening a little between the Western countries and China, but specifically America and China.
Anyway, Jared, you got a rant or a rave, maybe a little positivity for us?
I do have a rave. Oh, yes, John, I've got a rave today. We are releasing some merchandise for the podcast and for Mandarin Companion. Now, before everyone gets all excited about this, you should actually be more excited because they're not actually Mandarin Companion and You Can Learn Chinese podcast t-shirts. These are t-shirts about learning Chinese. All right, so we already have a few shirts out. I should say actually 4 with more designs to come. So we have I don't give a shi. So like 事情的事. Also, I've got, if you've seen that meme with the angry guy pointing at his hand and he goes, Jugga. So I have that one. We have some other ones we've designed as kind of a play on the Bernie Sanders meme. We have a whole bunch of ones coming down the line, pretty shuai for a lao wai. And John, I'm really excited for the one series I'm working on right now, which is going to be the animal shirts. Right?
Yeah. We've talked about that quite a bit.
Oh, yeah. So you're going to have ones that have a bunch of animals on it. So it's going to be like the bag rat, the stinky weasel, the fire chicken, the business goose, the sea piggy. And those are all like kangaroo, skunk, turkey, penguin, dolphin, translated literally from Chinese. So we got a whole bunch of those. You can check them out in the show notes. We're just trying to get it out there yet. We don't exactly have them up on our website yet. But we will be pushing them as well through our Instagram and Facebook channel. And the one shirt that's going to be super awesome, I think that people are really going to want, we're going to have one that's going to says, 跟我说中文. So it's going to say, hey, speak Chinese with me. So if you want to practice your Chinese, just wear the shirt and you're guaranteed to get some conversations. And John, you know what the best selling one is going to be?
What?
And if you know what this means. Horse, horse, tiger, tiger.
Okay. I'm not impressed, man.
You just wait, John.
That's what you wanted to do. That's what you wanted. All right. Anyway, enough of this. Failed attempts at humor and successful, whatever. What do we got up next? We have an interview, right?
Interview. Let's cut right to it. Say your name.
Laszlo Montgomery.
And tell us what...
China History Podcast.
So you're the host of China History Podcast.
Host and creator.
Laszlo's China History Podcast is the go-to podcast if you want to learn all about the long and at times complex history of China and Chinese people around the world.
There's topics on things like Chinese philosophy, the history of Chinese tea, Chinese Americans, overseas Chinese.
Laszlo shared with me his stories and perspectives on China. I hope you enjoy this interview as much as I did. Stay with us. What captured your fascination about China in the very first place?
You know, I remember I was listening to your previous episode. You had Jeremy on, and I had sort of a very similar inspiration. As a young child, maybe 5, 6, 7 years old, going to Chinese restaurants. And at that young age and seeing all the Chinese art and the chopsticks and the teacups and the carved wood, you might laugh at that and say, Orientalism and this kind of stuff. But at that age, that was my gateway. So I always had that innate fascination. And then fast forward to 1979, I was in college, University of Illinois. Deng Xiaoping came to the United States and kickstarted relations. Jimmy Carter was president. And I was in college, January 1979. I'm just finishing off my sophomore year, and I see an advertisement in the Daily Illini offering 2 semesters of Mandarin in a summer program.
Well, what was your Chinese dream, Laszlo?
My Chinese dream was to study Chinese, learn to speak Chinese, and get a job on a freight forwarder or something. So how's that for vague and not very far-reaching?
Well, I think, when we're young like that, sometimes as we don't have those specific dreams, right? We just have something vague, right? But what happened for you there? I mean, you started learning Chinese. What was that even like back then?
1979. Well, first of all, there's no internet. So to learn Chinese, you had to do it by brute force. I used to walk around with my Liang Shi Qiu dictionary, and I just learned how to use it. Could read Bo Po Mo Fo and Pinyin, and I'm a master at looking things up in Chinese dictionaries. It was rough. And what was really interesting was also 78, 79, the first students from China began coming to America to study. They were all scientists. They were advanced degree engineers and whatnot. And they were all mostly men in their 40s. And they came here a very, very basic subsidy. So a lot of them came to the University of Illinois because it was the top engineering school in the country, one of them. And this was wild. These were people from China. I grew up in these Cold War days. There was no relations with China. If you met a Chinese, they were from Hong Kong or just some overseas Chinese. It was very, very rare to meet someone that lived in China. So knowing these guys was a real trip. It was a real eye-opener. I learned so much from them. And hanging out with them, I teach them English, and they would teach me Chinese and how to cook. And started thinking about a career. Maybe I'll move out to Asia. In 1981, when I graduated, the options were not like they are now. So I moved out to LA. I said, I'll get on that Pacific coast. It's closer to the Pacific Rim. And, there's more opportunities to get out to China than in Chicago.
This is a great thing to hear from you, Laszlo. A lot of people out there, they're studying Chinese. And some people just have an interest in Chinese. Some people, maybe their parents wanted them to do it. Some people just saying, hey, I have these career goals. But I want to hear, what kind of opportunities did Chinese open up for you?
I moved out to LA. I worked at a company called the Flying Tiger Line. It was an air freight company. FedEx bought them in 89. And I, other than speaking to my Chinese colleagues, I didn't use it at all. I was in computer operations. I just moved out to Hong Kong. I said, screw it. 1989, with no job, no nothing. I'd just been married. My wife is from Vietnam, so moving to Asia was no big deal for her. But June 4th had just happened.
For our listeners who may not be familiar, what is June 4th?
The Tiananmen Massacre, or what you want to call it.
Well, you have a whole podcast about that, right?
It's mentioned in several episodes, but anyway, it's a sad moment in Chinese history. It's still sad all these years later. But it had really put a damper. Everyone told me, said, don't go out to China. US-China relations are finished forever, and there's no future. And so I went anyway. I found a job in a career that that's where I spent the whole arc of my career, in manufacturing consumer products in China for the US and European mass market. All I ever wanted was a nice office in a tall building and working for some investment company or something. And I ended up in this career, but it was good.
Well, Laszlo, something I want to hear about is you were in Hong Kong right before the handover back to China. And that was in 97, is that right?
Yeah, July 1st, 97.
So you had a front row seat to this. What was that like?
You knew you were watching history unfold. I'll never forget the day, and it was just very stormy. The governor there, Chris Patton, he was going to show China, put in all these democratic reforms, and China did not like that. Oh, it was such a process to watch it unfold month by month. And then the day came, and on July 2nd, woke up, and it was just like any other day. All these things that ultimately happened and happened recently and over the past few years. That was the worst case scenario. People would say, oh, might that happen? And, people said China stands to gain nothing from doing that. And, it's funny now, to remember so clearly and having these discussions.
So Laszlo, I want to hear from you, what started your fascination into Chinese history? Because, you have the Chinese history podcast, and it's been going for 10 years now?
Yeah, 10 years.
So, normal people don't do this. So
I never said I was normal.
So, how did this start for you?
I was a Chinese history major at University of Illinois, and I had a second major in Asian studies in Mandarin. But in around 2008, when podcasting started to come out of its shell, and there was this one guy, his name was Bob Packett, and he was sort of a corny, folksy kind of a guy, just sort of like the high school history teacher that nobody ever forgets. And he did this podcast called History According to Bob. Ran the whole thing from the seat of his pants. And he just covered general history from all over the world. He taught it as an academic, teaching it to non-academics. I listened to him quite a bit, and I thought, gee, I could do this. Why don't I do something with Chinese history? So I just started recording. I recorded 10 episodes with my MacBook, talking into the built-in mic in my living room in my home, which had this big cavernous high ceilings, all wood floors, and it was like an echo chamber. But I didn't know. I didn't know what I was doing. I feel it took about 100 episodes to figure out how to do it and sort of come into my own style.
Well, something that I'd be interested to hear about from your perspective. You've been doing this for a long time. You have read more Chinese history than any of us listening are probably ever going to get into. So you have covered even a lot of stories of foreigners that moved to China 100, 200, 300 years ago, right? Early days, and even early missionaries and stuff who went to China. I remember reading the story of William Mency, one of those podcasts that you covered him. And I want to hear from you. What perspective could you give to us about learning Chinese? What did these guys go through? How did they actually do it? There were no textbooks back then.
Wow. I get asked that question a lot. Get out there. You got to go move there. Either move to Taiwan or move to China. That's what was it for me. I studied Chinese for 2 years and lived in California for 8 years, speaking it a little bit with colleagues. And by the time I got to Hong Kong in 89, I could still barely speak. Now, even though I was in Hong Kong and even though everyone spoke Cantonese, I was the only Westerner, was the only foreigner in this Chinese company. And it was sink or swim. A lot of them did not speak English, but they did understand Mandarin. So if I wanted to get anything done in the company, I had to get over my fears and embarrassment and had to just start speaking it. And that's really, all of a sudden, I just started having vertical growth in my speaking ability and writing, because I had to write a lot of memos.
You had handwrite then, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I had to I was using a typewriter. I had to drag the boss kicking and screaming to buy his first PC in 1994 or something like that.
Wow.
Yeah, it was really ancient.
Can you think back of any stories, any interesting stories of some of these early days of what they went through to learn Chinese or anything like that?
They all did the same thing. They all learned it by going out there and being forced to speak it. I believe that is the only way to do it. Trust me, I am the guy with 25 dictionaries in books with vocabulary words. You could learn all the book learning you want and listen to all the tapes. I did learn from the Defense Language Institute.
Oh, yeah.
Tapes,
Yeah, I know that stuff.
They teach you dialogue that you would never use unless you went into the military. You got to go out there. So that's what I always tell people. And I've gotten feedback. I've gotten emails from podcast listeners who have said, hey, I listened to what you said, and now I'm living in Nanjing, and everything's great, and I'm working, and our language is really improving.
So I'm also kind of curious. You have a lot of perspective because you've looked at a lot of the history of China. What do you see as like the future of China and the importance of Chinese in the world economy?
Well, it'll always be a giant in the world economy, but my main concern is trying to get out of the situation that the U.S. and China over the past several years have sort of, each side has sort of painted itself into a corner. So I don't know who's going to make the first move, but we have to get out from behind this situation that's been created where the two countries have become very adversarial.
What do you think would be a solution to that?
Well, a lot of people say, a change in leadership, but the leadership may change, but the feelings will still be there. And I believe in the United States, a lot of people sort of feel they've been taken, and their China dream, as they envisioned it, became a China nightmare. And I think there's a lot of anger and frustration about that. So how to reconcile that, and how does China go from the 21st century equivalent of the Soviet Union? When I was growing up, we hated Russia because they were this eternal bad guy out to destroy the United States. And that was my fear about that happening in China. And it's happening in many parts of American society. People will tell you, they're just the personification of evil. And so we're in this situation. It was all thanks to social media and the internet and the whole so-called echo chamber of the internet. And so U.S. and China right now is in a bad way. And the collateral damage to common people like you and me is quite profound. So how to get out of this situation and move forward. Back when Nixon had the idea to go to China, middle of the Cultural Revolution, the U.S. imperialists, we were the lowest form of life on Earth. Yet, despite all that, we had a few good decades. So I think, okay, we're back to where we once were, where the spokesmen for the respective governments revile each other. But how to move beyond that is really, I think, something very important in the coming years, regardless of what happens in November.
Now, you mentioned something they call the Chinese dream, and even China, they have 中国梦.
Yeah.
Right? What is that?
Everyone has had their Chinese dream going back to the 19th century. There used to be that old saying about, if these Chinese would only add another inch on the hem of their gowns, would keep the mills of Manchester running, for eternity or something like that. So there was always this China dream of economic riches and of making China this friend and future bastion of democracy.
Why is that so elusive? And I've listened to some of the stories on your podcast of people coming chasing their Chinese dream, and who has actually achieved that? And why do most people not get there?
I think a lot of people have gotten there, at least looking from an American or North American perspective. You look at someone like Mark Rosewell. There's a fantastic success story. What a positive figure. He gave me so much inspiration in the 90s. He's just this great bridge of friendship just in one person. So there's one.
That's true. That's true. And for any listeners, Mark Rosewell, he's a Dashan. He speaks Chinese pretty much better than most natives do in China.
But something, back in the 90s, that was like, oh, wow, it's amazing. There were other Dashans too. But now gee, guys like Mark Rosewell, they're a dime a dozen. There's so many young people going to China that just like, wow, man, that is awesome.
Laszlo, like, what is a piece of Chinese history you think that like most Westerners, like something that they have no idea about, but you think is something like should be important for people to know?
I think what's important to know is we most remember recent history. And that's this, which is something that China's not very proud of, the so-called century of humiliation and whatnot. But beginning in the last 150 years of the Qing dynasty, because it's recent, because it's modern history, recent history, it's more understood than ancient history. It's something we could get our hands around. There's more material on it. There's more that's been written on it. There are pictures. And this whole notion today of China that was pushed around by the foreigners and suffered all this deprivation, war, and civil war. So I was just trying to make that point. There's a lack of understanding about Asia in general and China in particular. And that's why I have the China History podcast.
I think back to my history class in high school. I mean, I had to like English kings and talking about the Romans. It was so Eurocentric, right? Seriously, I learned nothing about Africa except for the colonization of Africa. Asia, like a dynasty. Yeah, I think they have those, right?
I've been doing this history of Xinjiang for several months. I'm just about to do part 11 next week.
Mm-hmm. And for our listeners, Xinjiang, it is the westernmost province of China. So it borders Russia and Kazakhstan. And
right. And it's something that's in the news a lot because of all the issues there. And there's really, other than hearing the name, there's, at least in the United States, people don't really know what the history is. So that's why I did this series, to try and provide some background. Sometimes that's good enough. Most China History podcast listeners, they're not looking for a whole 18-course banquet to know everything there is to know. They just want to get the main idea. So in a lot of what I present, it's just offering the main idea so that you can be better informed about some of the things you're reading today. When I started this, it was literally the final nail to get me to start going was watching C-SPAN and listening to American representatives in the Senate and the House, just spew their ignorance about China. It's like, God, how did you get this far and have not even a bare bones grasp?
If you could go back when Deng Xiaoping was visiting China, you had your whole interest in China really took root, what would you do differently, if anything?
I would have immediately gone out to China. That's what I would have done. 1981, I waited 8 years before I was already 30 years old before I moved out to China. Although I did visit in 1980.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I went out there as a student. You wanted to go to China back then. It was not easy if you were, a civilian. There was only one way in. You had to get a tour through the China Travel Service. Good old Zhongli. So you had to go there. It was anywhere between $1,500 to $2,500. You buy like a 10-day, 2-week tour, and that was how I saw China.
Wow.
1980. I'll never forget it. And, that's what really did it for me.
Do you have a prominent memory from that time?
I remember 1980, shoot, if you were a foreigner, people would just like, wow, it was like seeing a Martian. People would just circle you. I remember being at Tiananmen Square in 1980 and just sort of walking around. There must have been 200 people circled around me trying to propaganda. And I remember somebody from the Gong'an came and broke up the crowd, and took me away, very nicely. That was wild to be a nobody. And then people are so curious about you. That was only 4 years out of the Cultural Revolution when I was there. But just feeling the friendship and the genuine curiosity of the people. So that really inspired me a lot. Yeah, I got to know a few people. I was in Qingdao. Qingdao had just opened the day before I got there. It was really,
wow.
Even a Spartan would have complained. But yeah, at that age, 21 years old, I didn't care. but got to know, I'd go hang out. I'd walk on the beach in the morning, and over the days that I was there, I got to know this guy, this old guy who had taught himself English. He was a factory worker.
Wow.
This guy was like, I remember this guy, I'll never forget him, Zhang Chunpei. He was a chain smoker, and he'd sit there and we'd be on the beach with the wind blowing, and this guy knew how to light a match in the wind and light his cigarette without the wind blowing it out. Good old Zhang Chunpei. And when I had these great conversations with him, and we were followed by Gong'an people. I remember when I was talking to him in Chinese, he'd say, "Oh, no, speak English," because he knew that we were being followed.
Wow.
And I stayed in touch with him for years. And he'd send me lists of books that he wanted, all classics and whatnot. And I'd send him all these paperbacks constantly. And I just love Chinese culture and meeting these people from China. I had so many friends in Hong Kong and Taiwan. I was like, this is for me. And still is.
Laszlo, you're impacting hundreds of thousands of people in your podcast. I think you're helping to facilitate greater understanding between many different countries.
I'm reminded of that every single day. Every single day, I'm reminded of that with the emails and comments that I get.
Well, Laszlo, thank you for what you do. Now, Laszlo, tell anyone, where can they find you if they want to find out more about you?
Okay, the China History Podcast. It is located in all the podcast apps, and you can access my entire social media profile at my website at teacup.media. And I have a YouTube channel, a SoundCloud channel.
We'll put some links in the show notes, so anyone listening, you can find out more about Laszlo and his podcast there. So, Laszlo, thanks so much for taking the time to be with us on this podcast. We really appreciate you taking the time.
My pleasure, Jared.
You have been listening to the You Can Learn Chinese podcast. Help us spread the word by sharing this with your friends, classmates, teachers, cousins, student driver, happy camper, mountain hiker, rainbow chaser, chili maker, and that one guy named Dylan. You can subscribe on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. And please write us a review so we know how we're doing. You can find us on Facebook and at mandarincompanion.com. Apologies to John Cena. We just ran out of time. The You Can Learn Chinese podcast is produced by myself, Jared Turner, and our editor is James Harper. I'd like to thank our guest, Laszlo Montgomery, and of course, thanks to my co-host, the man, the myth, the legend, John Paston. See you next time.